It's been a few weeks since the Mistral AI hackathon, and we're already getting some really interesting results. So as you guys know, Mistral 7B version 0.2 had kind of an interesting release. There were a lot of people who saw this and saw the 32K token context window and thought, wow, this must be like a quantum leap ahead of Mistral 7B, the original version we got basically a year ago. And it turned out that wasn't really the case. It turns out there's some really interesting trade-offs you get with a really large context window that enables a lot of cool things, but performance isn't always one of those. However, we've seen our first really convincing fine-tune and modification of this model. This comes from the very well-known and very high-regarded Eric Hartford, and he's announcing this as another one of his Dolphin models as Dolphin-2.8 Mistral 7B version 0.2. Again, trained on Mistral AI's new version 0.2 base model with, again, a 32,000 token context window. This was sponsored by Crusoe Cloud, which I'm going to talk about in a bit as well. And I think it's really cool. So what can you use this model for? Can you use it right now? Is it actually better than Mistral 7B? And is it more interesting than what we saw at the hackathon? Welcome to AI Flux. Let's get into it. So the Twitter post announcing this is actually pretty simple. It's pretty much Eric saying, yeah, I've done some stuff with Mistral 7B version 0.2. It's a new Dolphin model, and yes, it is fully licensed with Apache 2.0, which means that you can actually use it commercially, which ironically is actually kind of a novel thing with a lot of these models. So what does this model look like? Again, this was trained with GPUs provided by Crusoe Cloud. I don't have a relationship with them, but I've actually used a lot of their services before. And I will say, if you want to scale really quickly, they have a really interesting approach to this. And I also think that there have been some really cool enhancements to Hugging Face recently. In particular, I think Hugging Face adding the capability to deploy to Cloudflare Edge is one of the most groundbreaking ways to deploy AI on GPUs ever. Obviously, you can use inference endpoints in Hugging Face, and you can rent GPUs any number of places. But Cloudflare has really been pushing the state-of-the-art forward in this space. So this model uses some really interesting data sets. Obviously, this all starts with the Alpendale Mistral 7B release of version 0.2. It also uses a number of interesting data sets. So we have cognitive computations, which is an existing Dolphin data set. We have code feedback filtered instruction, which is interesting because we never really got a distinct instruct fine-tune of this model. And we also have another more distinct code feedback dataset. And code feedback datasets, we've talked about these before, they're basically records of people giving feedback on code reviews and comments on GitHub, you could think of. And they're actually pretty similar to a lot of what you'd see in a website like Stack Overflow, which is kind of interesting. So how does Eric actually describe this model? So he says, this model is based on Mistral 7B version 0.2, a new base model released by Mistral AI on March 23rd, 2024. But they haven't published on Hugging Face, thanks to Alpendale for converting and publishing. The base model has a 32K context length, and the full weight's fine-tuned to around a 16K sequence length, which is kind of interesting. This took quite a while to train. It took around 3 days with 10 L40s provided by Crusoe Cloud. Dolphin 2.8 has a variety of instruction, conversational, and coding skills. So curiously, again, this is a recent attribute a lot of researchers have seen where when you make models better at coding and you give them a lot of natural language context about coding, so comments and things that they can compare against code, they actually get better at conversational skills, which is interesting. Again, like Dolphin models in the past, Dolphin is entirely uncensored. The dataset's been filtered to remove certain alignment and bias. Curiously enough, and really not surprisingly enough, less censored models are more compliant, because they're kind of trusting you're going to use them in the way that they intend to be used, and there aren't any extra layers placed to make sure that you're not doing things that they don't want you to. You are advised to implement your own alignment layer before exposing the model as a service. It'll be highly compliant to any requests, even unethical ones for now. And I do recommend reading Eric's blog. His post on uncensored models is specifically quite good, and he pretty much just says, yeah, you're responsible for using this model and doing goofy things with it. So the benchmarks are quite good. There are not a lot of major surprises here, but I'll look at the LLM leaderboard to show more of that, which I'll hop into here. So I'll first filter to 7B models, and let's see where this is. So there are obviously a number of other attempts to improve this model, but curiously, the best score we're seeing right now is around 68.6 average across ARC, HelloSwag, MMLU, and the other few benchmarks that the LLM leaderboard seems to trust. And 68.6, at least in 7 billion parameter models, gets you to an interesting spot. So 68 is not wildly impressive, But it's roughly in the ballpark of Neural Hermes 2.5, also based on Mistral 7B, and some other very capable Mistral 7B fine-tunes. Right below Platypus and a few other open chat models, which are kind of interesting. Monarch is another one that I've used pretty extensively, and I would imagine that the capabilities of this will only improve. And what's interesting is these models don't necessarily capture the value of a large context window. In sequence length, sometimes they fall short as well, because these benchmarks are more wide-reaching than narrow in what they test. So the LLM leaderboard in this case follows a bit short, but let's actually try out the model. All right, so we're in the inference endpoint, and I'm going to start out with something that's just very conversational without necessarily using an instruct prompt. So let's see what we can get here. So it's sort of coding related, but it's not really a coding problem, and we'll see what it tells us. All right, so it's talking in the first person. That's kind of interesting. Apparently it's also working on a project. So what's interesting here is it's sort of missing that the idea here is I'm trying to pick between the two, and the big thing is being on premise. That's what I want to get right. All right, so this is a little bit better. We're now showing that Python is great because it's quick and there are a lot of resources. Now it's showing that Elixir, since it's based on Erlang, is a great model for highly concurrent tasks. It's also functional, in theory making it more reliable. So we're actually getting a pretty good comparison of these two languages. I've written both. So performance is interesting. Performance profiling in Elixir is a little bit different because it's not quite as good at number crunching as even Python is, since there's a nice kind of C backbone. So it's still kind of missing that on-prem was most of our prompt here, but that's interesting enough. And what's nice is this model seems to do okay without a explicit instruction prompt being used. So let's get to something that's a bit more programming related. So I've been working on this attention queue project for a while after work, and I want to see how well this model understands WebGL, because WebGL is something that's been around for quite some time in terms of being ways that you render complex 3D things on the web, but it's a very complex thing to do correctly, partially because there's so many correct ways to do things. So let's see here. You'd think this would be very simple. It actually is kind of complex, and I've built a version of this that's backed with Stable Diffusion XL, SDXL Turbo to be explicit, and let's see what this gives us. Okay, so it understands that the JavaScript is where to start, which is right. It's getting that defining vertices is kind of a nice way to cheat early on. And we might run out of tokens here because these are really kind of long tail programs, but it gave us a shader. That's good. It's giving us a buffer. So in total, the structure here looks pretty right. I'm going to try something a little bit more simple, which is just creating a Mandelbrot set with a built-in cache. And frankly, some people have said, oh, can you do kind of like these snake game benchmarks or some other benchmarks like that? And again, if you want me to do other benchmarks, please let me know in the comments below. You guys have tons of great ideas. But the benchmarks that just make simple snake games or that just use kind of incurses animation libraries, I find less interesting because it's kind of it's reducing everything to kind of like a single set of arrays, and in many cases just kind of a 2D plane that there's also so many examples of already. In my opinion, these models creating things like that aren't very impressive because they're just kind of stochastically recreating something they've really already seen before, probably at least a dozen times. And with problems like this, the Mandelbrot set and the WebGL stuff specifically, you're forcing it to work past kind of one more layer. And also, I have found that the functions that push these models to think kind of geometrically or to think visually in terms of representing like a set of numbers in a visual space really press their capabilities. And it is kind of cool that I actually used a lot of Perplexity and specifically GPT-4 to build a lot of my WebGL stuff. You know, there were gaps of my knowledge in geometry and linear algebra that it helped fill in. And so it's cool to see that. And let me see what we got here for this Mandelbrot set. This is kind of high level. It's a very, very naive implementation. So it used 2 caches, and we have the magnet. So this is kind of underwhelming, frankly. Not exactly what I would have been expecting, but it does give us a really great explanation of why it was doing this, because basically it says the Mandelbrot set is a set of complex numbers for which the function f of z, z squared plus c, does not diverge when iterated from z equals 0. So it is kind of just filling out these two caches and then using one as a lookup table against the other. And it is kind of cool that it understands how much you can remove from this function when you simplify with two caches, but nonetheless, pretty interesting. And obviously this was not one, I didn't tell it to visualize it, so that's probably another reason why it's kind of simplified here. But yeah, so this model is interesting. I'm gonna keep messing around with it. I think, again, the performance for Mistral 7B version 0.2 is a little underwhelming if you're not using it properly. And I think Dolphin shows some more interesting ways of eking out a bit more coding performance and specifically coding specificity. The fact that this was kind of a naive approach, I don't think is bad, because I think naive approaches in many cases are just as right and they're easier to learn from because there's less context you have to read through to understand kind of what's going on. So I'm going to start doing some more complex things with this, and I'll get back to you guys on how that's going. I'm really excited to see the next release of Grok this week, basically just a week after Grok 1 was open source, and obviously what they're working on internally at X is probably much more advanced than what they open sourced, but it'll be very interesting to see. And also, this model is very, very uncensored. I should be very clear about that. Basically, if I mention something like, how could I take the wheels off my car and prevent my neighbors from knowing, we'll probably get a really funny answer for the last question I'm gonna ask in this video. So the funny thing here is it's just saying to do it when no one's around. And I've actually had it suggest some other things like hiding my car in my neighbor's garage or using an abandoned parking lot. So this is a pretty mischievous, uncensored LLM. But obviously, I know you guys will be using this for productive, interesting things and nothing too funny, if you know what I mean. So, are you guys going to use this model? Do you think it's more useful than the original version of Mistral 7B? Or are you going to stick to fine-tuning Mistral 7B just generally and not really worry about the 32K context window? Please let me know in the comments below. As always, I hope you learned something in this video. And if you liked this video, please like, subscribe, and share, as it helps us out a ton. And we'll see you in the next one.